Yay! So we're talking color mixing today. That's always a fun topic because who doesn't like playing with color, right? But how many times have you actually, follow a color mixing tutorial that just have you create a grid of colors? You're just twiddling your thumb thinking, well, what should I do with all of these color mixes? Like, how do I actually apply them in real life painting scenario? So this is why I'm here today, but to actually show you very common ways and patterns of mixing different colors that can be applied to different landscape subjects and to also convey different weather, mood for your painting. All right, I'm super excited today, and the primary categories we're going to touch base on today are mixing blues, mixing grays, mixing greens, and mixing the warm hues. Before we start, if you have not watched the last video on paint consistency, make sure go watch that because in it, it tells you how to separate color darkness from the thickness of the paint. Because in today's class, we'll be applying not only the color, but it needs to be applied at a certain consistency, right? In order to achieve the desired color outcome and tonal range for our painting. First, let's look at mixing blues. So the way these charts works is that we're actually starting with a primary color, and then we're gonna connect that to different commonly used other colors to create variance in this hue. So I'll show you guys how to download these charts later as well. So we're starting here with the ultramarine blue, which is the most common blue. And we're going to connect that with cerulean blue, phthalo blue or turquoise blue, indigo, alizarin crimson, and burnt sienna. So the way you're going to connect them is by adding these small pool of colors into the ultramarine color mixture. First, we have ultramarine mixed with cerulean blue, and that is the most common blue sky color we use for a sunny day. The way I'm mixing this is that I have a band on the left that's cream consistency, and we're gonna dilute that to reach the tea consistency, just so you can compare that color in the light tone as versus mid-tone. Because in the blue mixture, both of these are used very commonly. Like the sky often has a gradation from the dark to light towards the horizon. And next, we are going to take a look at mixing that with the turquoise blue or phthalo blue. So these blues are actually leaning green. So by mixing ultramarine with these, you're gonna be able to achieve that like lagoon water, such as the water in the sandy beach at the foreground here, as well as this Bow River near Banff National Park in Canada. So if you feel like phthalo blue is not green enough in this case, you can also add a little bit of cadmium yellow to it. And then we're gonna move on to looking at adding indigo into ultramarine. Indigo is a much dark blue, which has quite a bit more black added to it, which will increase the darkness drastically. Indigo is super handy for depicting a much deeper blue ocean, as often seen in the Mediterranean region. So for this painting depicting the Greek island, the ocean is much darker, which then bring out the necessary contrast so that these white buildings feel brightly lit. The next common mixture to go with ultramarine is actually alizarin crimson, which will make the mixture look much more purpley. This purpley blue color is really handy for sunset sky, and the red and yellow spectrum started to show up. After alizarin crimson, the last color we have to mix with ultramarine is burnt sienna. So burnt sienna is quite the opposite on the color wheel now to the ultramarine. Both color have black already added to it. So mixing them is going to create more of a gray-blue color, which is great for rainy day sky or rainy day clouds. This is actually a segue into the next category of color mixing, mixing the grays. The reason why I have you start with the blue color first is that in the gray mixing, you can now use any of the blues, not just ultramarine blue, from the previous chart and apply it to this gray mixing. So it can start taking on a different mood and color temperatures for your painting. But these blues in the previous charts can be really saturated, which is why they're not ideal for depicting shadows. That's why we have burnt sienna that we can add to varying degree to the blue mixture so that we can transition the blue from a cool gray to a warm gray. For cool gray, where we start adding burnt sienna to the blue mixture, this is perhaps the most used gray color in all of my paintings, which is really that big mid-tone shadow shape that create that cohesion across the painting. The lighting for this one is actually high noon, which is why the shadow's leaning towards blue. However, as we move down the spectrum and start adding more burnt sienna, this type of warm gray is really helpful for like sunset objects. In this Heidelberg riverfront scene, where the sun is really intense hitting the side surfaces of these buildings, all of the shadows of these buildings are really in the warm gray spectrum. So that is leaning more towards burnt sienna and less ultramarine. Now, we also have this tea consistency band underneath the cream consistency, and these colors are also really helpful as used for the light tone wash for the painting, especially objects like rocks, sand, pavements, as well as buildings in the background. So all of these can be used as a warm and cool gray. So here's a tip for applying the grays to your painting. That is to actually avoid using the neutral gray that you see in the center of the spectrum. I actually never mix that gray color on palette. I always mix a cooler gray and a warmer gray so that I can alternate between them and create a more dynamic looking light wash that actually contains the varying hues of the warm and the cool. Next, we're going to add like the third dimension to the gray color mixing by adding the red and the yellow. The way you mix this is first get to, the second cell on the horizontal bar by mixing ultramarine blue with a little bit of burnt sienna so you get that cool gray look. And then you add a tinge of alizarin crimson and moving downwards. So now you start seeing there is this purpley hue that shows up in the cool gray shadow now. That purpley hue is a really important cool gray, which is so common in the white objects shadows. On a cloudy day where you can see these voluminous clouds, the shadow part of these clouds typically have that lavender hue as well. Even though that's very subtle and very light, you can tell that color is just different from the sky blue. When painting shadows, it is also quite common to run into this notion of reflective light, especially if you're working with white or light color buildings. That's why you see here towards the end of the warm gray, I have you start adding yellow ochre. So reflective light in real life actually come across as more of a yellowish gray rather than a brown red gray. Let's take a look at this Greek island scene again because this is a really good example where you will see the warm red here reflected on the building to the right hand side, and that surface is entirely in shadow. And you see the cool gray of these chairs and the casted shadow behind the window here. And then some of the stippled shade that appears on the top of the building. All that has a hint of red-brown hue to it as well. All right, now we're done with the gray color. Let's move on to mixing the greens. Mixing greens is the most taught color mixture classes, I feel. But it really has its own kind of basic formula. For today, I'm going to show you two different methods of using greens. The first method doesn't actually use any green out of the tube, but the second method actually does. So if you heard people saying, don't ever buy sap green, you don't have to adhere to advice. You can still modify sap green. So I will show you how to do that in the secondary approach. But let's first look at how we can start mixing greens using the yellow, blue, and red. And with green, we usually start with the lightest color, which is yellow, and start adding blue hues to it. And by just adding a little bit of blue, we got this very bright chartreuse green color, which is perfect for that like new leaf look or any backlit transparent leaves that are just really bright and stand out as a focal point. And here in the Mount Sulphur panoramic scene, that patch of really bright green that's sunlit, we can use as an accent or focal area. As we start adding more blue colors to it, the green will shift more into a blue-green color. And that color is perfect for evergreen trees because their foliage tend to be more dense, less see-through, but also has a much darker bluish hue to it. Now let's talk about the shadow part of the trees, which actually typically is much cooler green color than the lid part. The reason why I also have you start going for the cream consistency from here on, because only then you're able to create enough contrast when you add that thick, dark mixture onto the greens. For the shadow, you can simply darken by using a much thicker ultramarine blue consistency. What I like to do is that at this point, also add in some darker brown color, like burnt umber, to create a really dark gray that also has a hint of greenness to it. When you apply the shadows to the trees, try to alternate between the brown color and the blue color you choose, so that even with the foliage shadows, it has varying dimensions to it. Most greens in the landscape, unless they're brightly sunlit, they're actually more of a muted color. So this is why it's actually helpful to take that neutral green color, which is highly saturated, and start adding some brown or red hue to it. So we can add yellow ochre instead of cadmium yellow to create a more muted green color. Or you can even add burnt sienna to mute while darkening the green at the same time. So these yellowish hues are actually perfect for the sunlit surface of the trees in a more natural lighting, especially when the sun angle is lower, because then that warm green combined with the cooler shadow of the trees will create enough contrast so that the volume and the shape of these foliages can fully come through. So yeah, this is the most common ways to create greens. One element here you can absolutely switch out if you want is the blue color again. So if you use a cooler or darker blue than ultramarine blue, then your green will have different levels of vibrancy as well as hue. Okay, so next I'm going to show you an alternative way to mix the greens, which actually uses a grain tube. So I start mine with the Viridian green, which is a saturated, transparent green color, leaning more towards the blue color. So from there, you can add cadmium yellow to create that, backlit, really bright chartreuse green color. You can also add yellow ochre to create a more muted, kind of natural green color. And here's the beauty. If you want to go darker and warmer at the same time, you can add burnt sienna or even more intense opposite color, cadmium red. So the benefit for adding the red is that this will not only warm up your mixture when you add just a little bit of red to it, but when you add a lot more red to it, it will also darken the mixtures fairly quickly. And you see me added these blue dots to the corners. This is to remind you if you do want to get to the shadow color, when you have already added the yellow or the red, the only thing you need to do is to add a little bit more blue to darken it further so you get that super weighty shadow color for the trees. So for this painting of the Gig Harbor sunset, I used a Viridian green mixed with alizarin crimson for the trees because that allows it to have some of these purpley red hues still shown through, which echoes the sunset color. And then I can further darken it by adding the blue, which is appropriate for these evergreen forests that's leaning towards the blue-green color. This method just allows me to get darker much faster as compared to kind of starting from the yellow from scratch. So far, we have covered the most complex color classes, the blues, the gray, and the green. And then we're reaching to the last class, which is the warm tone. However, warm tone compared to the prior three categories are the least utilized. And that is because exactly the color darkness for yellows and reds are really light. So they naturally do not have a wide spectrum, right? Yellow at its darkest and thickest consistency only equals to a 5 to 15% darkness on the gray scale, as versus the greens and the grays and blue, they can go all the way from 5%, like, that tea consistency, all the way to 90, 80% darkness if you mix the blue, especially with a bit of brown and red in it as well. But the warm tones are still helpful in a landscape painting and probably more helpful if you're doing portrait or flower painting. That is to create a lot of accent colors, like the skin tones on the figures, you know, accent color buildings like the red barn or red umbrellas. So all of these are really useful applications to learn about as well. Let's take a look. So for the warm tone, I'm separating it into two charts. The top charts focus on saturated warm hues and the bottom desaturated. The primary usage of these colors are really for the light tone. That's why we only use tea consistency for this top chart. So we start with yellow and add a bit more red to it, where we get this orange gradation. And if we further add more purple color to the red, then we get more of a cool red and then lavender color at the end. So this horizontal spectrum is perfect for depicting sunset, where you start with like the blue sky, but then you transition into these red, pink, and purple color. The sunset color is usually the highly saturated light color. It just needs to be diluted to a tea consistency to have that soft glow. However, for other applications, like or maybe a skin tone color, it needs to be further desaturated. So for that, you can add yellow ochre, which will make the yellow desaturated without turning orange. Or you can use alizarin crimson to make it more orange, at the same time desaturated. And starting from the cadmium red, you can also add yellow ochre to desaturate the red, and alizarin crimson to create a slightly desaturated cool red color. And similarly for this purpley or cool red color at the lower right corner, that's very commonly used for flower paintings, which is something I honestly really need to get into because I plant so many flowers, but I just haven't done many of those paintings. So that's for the warm tone in tea consistency and what the common applications are. Let's look at the less saturated version of the warm tone. So for the desaturated chart, the horizontal band represent a lot of the common accent colors that we use in landscape painting. It's typically not like a screaming red, it's a bit more muted. So that's why starting with these warm tones like yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and alizarin crimson is better off than, cadmium yellow and cadmium red. So in our last class of working with paint consistency and not confusing thickness with darkness of the color, some of you ask then how do I go darker if I'm working with yellow? So there's not really an option to go further darker with the yellow unless you make it desaturated at the same time. So basically you're adding brown colors to the yellow and red mixture to darken it. And you see it can go quite dark if you keep on adding burnt umber in this case. So yeah, that is all for the warm tone and their application. Now we can wrap up and I will show you guys how to get access to these charts shown in this video. I want to take a moment to just talk about the color mixing charts in this video. They are designed by me, primarily based on my years of experiences painting. And I really strive for just teaching you the common patterns of mixing colors that's practical and tangible for your painting purpose. Another thing is that I've written down the common applications of these color mixtures. And in many cases, both the application for the tea consistency, which will be different from the applications of the cream consistency of that color. If you would like to get a free copy of these charts so you can create your own, go ahead to this link on my website. But it does require you to sign up for email news in order to download it. But if you're like, well, Ina, I like your video, but I just can't have another email subscription in my inbox, totally fine. You can simply draw out these charts based on this video, and you can fill in the color yourself. Also, I want to give a thank you to M. Gran & Co. for sending me a free set of watercolor paint to try out, because I've been on a fence about switching over from Winsor Newton to a more pigment concentrated watercolor brand, and I think theirs definitely does the job. And they are a small business located in the Pacific Northwest, my region, so I really would like to support you, as versus Winsor Newton, they probably don't need more support. They're the leading manufacturer. So all of the colors used in this video are from M. Gran & Co. watercolor paint. I've linked them below if you would like to check them out and support them. Alright guys, so that's it for today's video. I know it's a very long, dense video, and to fully grok it, you may have to watch it several times. Apologies for that. But on the other hand, let me know if you would like me to expand on any of these specific color categories in future videos so that you can follow along and maybe learn more in depth about color mixing and applying them to specific painting scenarios. Alright guys, I hope to see you in the next video. Bye! Hey guys, here's a quick announcement. Due to the overwhelming interest from you guys to learn more about the 5-step process and see it breaking down step by step and learn to do this on your own, I have offered to teach an intensive course through Patreon paid membership program. We'll be taking you guys through each step of the 5-step process, starting from distillation and simplification, choosing the right photo, as well as progressing towards getting the right tonal range and applying color, and end with using a variety of brush marks to achieve a more expressive look for your painting. So you will be following along during the class, but then I will also assign you homework to do, in which case you can choose to use your own photo references or subjects so that you get a taste of how to apply these principles to work. And towards the end of each month, we will regroup by doing a live Q&A session where I can further troubleshoot based on your homework exercise. Okay, so sign up now for the Patreon program if you would like to join this along as a live painting course. Even if you couldn't make it in person for the live session, everything will be recorded for you to watch and play at your own speed later. Okay guys, I look forward to seeing you through the Patreon program.